Today we're going to test a Febco 2½ inch 805 YD double check valve assembly. To do the test, we're going to use a 5-valve test gauge. On the very top of the gauge it reads from 0 to 15 PSID, and on the bottom of the gauge we have a pressure gauge that reads from 0 to 200 PSI. The first thing we're going to do is test the test cocks for availability. So we'll be opening test cocks 1, 2, 3, and 4. There is no sequence because there is no relief valve. Number 1 is okay. Number 2 is okay. Number 3 is okay. And number 4 is okay. To do this test, we have to have a static or no flow condition. To do that, the number 1 shutoff valve is in the open position, and then the number 2 shutoff valve will be in the closed position. Because we don't have a discharge line connected, the number 2 shutoff valve is already closed. The assembly's construction consists of 4 test cocks. Number 1 test cock is in front of the number 1 shutoff valve. Number 2 test cock is in front of the number 1 check valve. Number 3 test cock is downstream of the number 1 check valve. And number 4 test cock is downstream of the number 2 check valve. We have 2 resilient seated gate valves. They're non-rising stem. To do this test, our first test will be to test the number 1 check in direction of flow. It is a measured test. As you recall, the springs inside the double check valve assembly are about 1 to 3 pound springs. To test each check individually, we have to have at least a 1 pound differential. So our first test will be to connect the high hose to test cock number 2. We will now connect the low hose to test cock number 3. We're going to bring on test cock number 2 and number 3. We're making the first check available to our 5-valve test gauge. We're now going to bleed the high side hose or the front side of the check. And we're going to close the high side bleed valve. We're now going to bleed the low side bleed valve, or the back side of the first check. And after we close the low side bleed, we'll have the first check pressure differential reading, which is 1.8 PSID on the gauge. The next test that we need to do on this 2½ inch double check valve assembly is to test the second check in direction of flow. To do that, we're going to connect the high side hose to test cock number 3 and the low hose to test cock number 4. We will turn on test cocks 3 and 4 to make the number 2 check valve available to the test gauge. We will now bleed the high side bleed, or the front side of the number 2 check. Close the high side bleed. We'll now bleed the low side bleed, or the back side of the number 2 check. And then we'll close the low side bleed, and we read about 1.8 on the number 2 check valve in direction of flow. As you recall, in a double check valve, both springs are about equal in tension, which is why the numbers are very close when we do the testing of the checks. Our next step is to test the outlet shutoff valve for tightness to validate both the number 1 and the number 2 checks. To do that, we're going to close test cocks 3 and 4. We will move the high side hose back to the number 2 test cock. We're going to move the low hose back to the number 3 test cock. And we will add the vent hose or the bypass hose to the number 4 test cock. To start this test, we first have to test the number 1 check, again to get our number to use to test the outlet shutoff valve. So we'll turn on test cocks 2 and 3. We'll bleed the high side or the front side of the number 1 check. Close it. Then we will bleed the low side or the back side of the number 1 check and close it. You'll notice that the number is 1.8. We're basically retesting the first check valve. This is the number we'll use to be able to see what's going on with the outlet shutoff valve to see if it's holding tight. The next step is to take high side pressure, take it through the test gauge and put it to the back side of the number 2 check. To do that, we're going to open up the high side control valve on the gauge and the vent or the bypass hose on the gauge. And then our last step is to turn on test cock number 4. We're basically taking high side pressure through the gauge to the back side of the number 2 check. It's back pressuring the number 2 check, but it also is pushing pressure against the outlet shutoff valve. The last part of the step is to close test cock number 2 and see if the gauge holds steady. We notice that the gauge is reading about 1.7. Holding steady tells us the outlet shutoff valve is holding tight. If it was leaking downstream, the gauge would drop to 0. Since it holds steady, it tells us that both number 1 and number 2 check valves are validated.